The snow outside the clinic had that soft, muffled sound to it, the way it does on a cold morning when the world hasn't quite woken up yet. Inside, it was so quiet you could hear the hum of the old heater and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. On the padded floor of the small treatment room, a woman knelt beside a bobcat. Her name is Grace. The bobcat is Hazel, and this was supposed to be the day Hazel died. Hazel lay on her side, breathing in short, careful pulls, her spotted flank rising and falling against the pale blanket. She wasn't the fierce, muscled creature visitors at High Ridge Wildlife Rescue remembered. She looked smaller now, like the illness had folded her in on herself. Grace kept one hand on Hazel's shoulder, thumb resting in the familiar hollow between bone and fur, the place Hazel always leaned into on better days. Her other hand smoothed the edge of the blanket, over and over, a tiny motion trying to keep her calm. Across the room, Dr. Maria checked the labels on her vials one more time. The syringe for the sedative gleamed under the fluorescent light. This was the kindest thing left, the conclusion every specialist had come to after months of tests. A rare neurological disease, untreatable, progressive, the sort of diagnosis that closes doors quietly, one by one. If you've ever stood in a room like this, you know it doesn't feel like anyone is being kind. It feels like the world is narrowing down to one terrible choice. Maria's voice was soft. "We'll start with this one," she said, holding up the sedative so Grace could see. "It'll let her drift off. She won't be scared. She won't feel any pain." Grace nodded, but her throat was too tight to answer. She'd heard those words before, in a hospital, years ago. Back then, it had been a father in a white bed, machines dozing along beside him. A doctor using the same calm tone to explain that keeping him on life support would only prolong the suffering. She remembered her father squeezing her hand just once when they said he wouldn't feel anything anymore. Now it was Hazel, not hooked up to machines, but caught in the same space between love and letting go. Hazel's eyes were half open, honey gold and cloudy with exhaustion. Her ears flicked once at Maria's voice, but her gaze stayed on Grace. It had been that way for 6 years, through storms, through feeding schedules, through quiet mornings when Grace sat outside the enclosure with a thermos of coffee, telling Hazel about her worries as you talk to an old friend. Hazel always looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her. "Hey, sweetheart," Grace whispered, leaning down so Hazel could see only her. "I'm right here. You've been so brave." She wasn't saying goodbye yet. The word goodbye felt too sharp in her mouth, like something that might cut both of them. Maria took a slow breath and knelt a few feet away, giving them a little space. "When you're ready," she said gently, holding the syringe in her gloved hand. The vet tech, Blair, stood by the cabinet, trying very hard to look steady, hands folded in front of them. Hazel had been Blair's first bottle baby at the center. This wasn't just a bobcat to them. This was their introduction to what love and loyalty look like when you choose a life around wild animals. Grace stroked Hazel's cheek. The fur there was still thick and beautiful, the faint markings that made Hazel seem almost painted. There had been so much life in this body. So many mornings, Hazel paced along the fence line, tail twitching as she tasted the wind, muscles rolling under her coat, all wild dignity and quiet power. Now those same muscles didn't always remember how to work. That was what the experts kept saying. Neurons misfiring, pathways breaking down, a disease that looked, on paper, like a locked door. Grace thought of all the moral stories people like to tell about knowing when to let go, about kindness and dignity. They sounded neat in a book, the kind of inspirational story you share over coffee. In real life, in a small room with a bobcat who trusted you, nothing felt neat. It was just emotions and breath, and a choice that didn't feel like a choice at all. "Okay," Grace said, barely audible. "Okay, I'm here." Maria shifted closer, heart heavy but hands practiced. She reached for Hazel's front leg, searching gently for a vein. And that's when Hazel moved. It wasn't a graceful motion. It was clumsy and almost desperate. She gathered her front legs under her, trembling, as if pulling herself up from the bottom of a pool. Grace instinctively leaned back to give her space. Instead, Hazel pushed forward. Both front paws came up, wrapping around Grace's shoulders. Hazel's head pressed into the hollow of Grace's neck, chin resting against her collarbone. Her body shook with the effort, but her claws stayed carefully sheathed. She was not grabbing. She was holding. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Grace froze, arms halfway lifted, then slowly closed them around Hazel's body, feeling every rib, every ridge in her spine. Hazel let out a sound Grace had never heard from her before. Not a hiss, not a purr exactly. It was something low and broken, like a sob turned inside out. Blair's hand flew to their mouth. Maria's eyes flooded. The syringe hovered in midair, the line between before and after, suddenly not so clear. Hazel stayed there, clinging, her face buried against the person who had bottle-fed her, cleaned her, argued for her when budgets were tight, sat with her through stormy nights and quiet summer evenings. 6 years of loyalty and love pressed into one embrace. If you've ever had an animal curl into you like that, you know the feeling. It's not fantasy. It's not a fairy tale. It's a simple, wordless act that somehow touches the most soulful places in you, the ones you thought had gone numb after too many losses. Grace's mind did something strange in that moment. Part of her was right there in that room whispering, "I've got you, Hazel. I've got you." Another part was back beside her father's bed, hearing the sigh when the machines were turned off, wondering, for years afterward, if she'd given up too soon. If she'd trusted, "There's nothing more we can do," because she didn't know how to ask harder questions. Maria lowered the syringe, her hands shaking. I can't do it. Not like this," she whispered. And that's when Blair's phone buzzed on the countertop. A small, ordinary sound in the middle of a huge, holy quiet. They glanced down, almost out of reflex, then did a double take. The subject line on the new email glowed on the screen. Hazel. Urgent. Possible misdiagnosis. Do not proceed with euthanasia. In one breath, the room held both things. A bobcat hugging her caretaker goodbye, and a stranger's message from far away saying, "Wait, we might have made a huge mistake." Grace didn't understand the details yet. She didn't know about rare fungal infections or false positives or specialized tests in another state. All she knew was that the animal in her arms was still here, still choosing her. In the very moment the world had decided it was over, she held Hazel a little tighter, not to keep her from leaving this life, but to anchor herself in the only thing that felt true. Kindness and loyalty had brought them this far. Maybe they weren't finished yet. If your heart is already leaning in, if some part of you is remembering your own Hazel, your own moment of almost letting go, stay with this story. It doesn't end in that small room. To understand why this hug stopped everything, we have to go back 6 years, to a much younger Hazel, a much more hopeful Grace, and the day they first became each other's home. Before Hazel ever wrapped her paws around Grace's shoulders in that little treatment room, she fit in the crook of one hand. Back then, no one was talking about miracles or mistakes. They were just trying to get a half-frozen bobcat kitten through the night. It started with an ordinary phone call on an overcast afternoon. High Ridge Wildlife Rescue sits on the kind of land most people just drive past. A patch of pines and pasture in western Montana. A gravel road, a faded sign. Grace was in the feed room, measuring out thawed mice for the owls when the landline rang. A rancher's voice came through, blunt but worried. He'd found a wild-looking kitten thing by his fence line. Mother, dead on the shoulder of the highway, hit sometime in the night. The little one was still alive, barely, hiding under a broken post. Grace could have passed the call to someone else. She was off in an hour. Her back hurt. The roads were slick. But something in the way the man said, "It's shivering. I don't know what to do with it," caught at that old, tender place in her. She knew what it felt like to be standing beside a body, not sure what to do next. So she grabbed a carrier, a towel warmed in the dryer, and her keys. When she opened the crate in the exam room, the smell hit first. Cold, dust, and a sour note of fear. Inside, the kitten made itself as big as it could, which wasn't very big at all. Blue eyes hazy, fur patchy and dull, little mouth open in a hiss that tried to sound dangerous and landed somewhere closer to desperate. "Bobcat," Maria said quietly from the doorway. "Maybe 8, 9 weeks. She's in trouble." Grace didn't answer. She just moved, slowly, lowering the warm towel into the crate. The tiny body flinched, batted weakly, then sagged when the heat soaked in. Under the ribs, she could feel every bone. "You're safe now," Grace murmured, more habit than thought. They were the same words she'd whispered to the old family dog on the night it died, the same words she'd spoken to her husband when they wheeled him into hospice, though neither of them quite believed them at the time. Only later would she realize how much her own heart needed to hear that sentence again. They named the kitten Hazel, for the color her eyes might be someday if she made it. That first night, Grace sat in the dim light of the treatment ward, long after everyone else had gone home. She held a small syringe of formula in one hand and Hazel's head gently in the other, coaxing the milk past tiny teeth that wanted to fight but didn't have the strength. "She's a wild animal," Maria reminded her. "No baby talk, no petting just to comfort you. We're helping her, not keeping her." Grace nodded, but as Hazel swallowed her first easy mouthful, a soft, rumbling vibration started in the little body. It wasn't quite a purr, not like a house cat. It was deeper, rougher, the sound of a small engine deciding it might start again. It was one of those heartwarming stories that never make the news. Just one woman, one bobcat, and a long, quiet night. In the weeks that followed, Hazel grew. Bones filled out, fur smoothed. Her eyes changed from clouded blue to clear gold. The hissing never entirely went away, but it softened, wrapped around curious chirps and chuffs. She didn't become tame. That was never the goal. She became strong. The state eventually decided Hazel was non-releasable. Anger, early stress, and the accident that killed her mother had left marks you couldn't see in a photograph. Her reaction times were just a little off. Her fear responses were strange. She'd beared too much risk out there on her own. So Hazel stayed, not as a pet, but as what the permits called an educational ambassador. A bobcat who would live out her life in a big, carefully built enclosure, teaching visitors, from a distance, what real wildness looks like. For Grace, that paperwork sealed something deeper. By then, she'd been widowed for almost 3 years. The house she drove back to at night felt more like a storage unit than a home. Her daughter lived 2 states away, busy and kind, but mostly a voice on holidays. The love and loyalty inside Grace didn't have many places to go. So, most mornings, before the volunteers arrived, she made herself a cup of coffee in a chipped blue mug and walked out to Hazel's enclosure. The air would be sharp and clean, the kind of cold that wakes you up even if you slept badly. Hazel usually sat waiting on her favorite flat rock, the one that caught the first light over the tree line. She'd lift her head when she heard the crunch of Grace's boots and let out a low, questioning chirp that sounded almost like, "Well?" Grace would settle onto the log just outside the fence, wrap both hands around the mug, and talk. Not in a fairy tale way, not spinning big inspirational storylines, just life. "How am I going to pay for the new roof, Hazel?" she'd say, watching her breathe in the morning smells. "Did you hear the coyotes last night? They sounded closer." She'd talk about her husband's old flannels she couldn't bring herself to throw away, about a neighbor who'd lost their own dog and stopped by the center just to listen to the hawks for a while. Hazel didn't reply, of course. She'd flick her tail, blink slowly, sometimes rise and walk the perimeter of the fence with that rolling, muscular stride bobcats are known for. Wild, but listening. Every so often, when the day was quiet and the mood was right, Hazel would come up to the mesh and press her forehead to it. Grace would lift her hand, palm flat, and feel the faint warmth of fur and bone through the wires. Small moments. But if you've lost someone, you know how small moments can feel big. On stormy days, when thunder rolled over the valley, Hazel reacted in her own way. not hiding like a house cat, but standing alert, ears pricked, eyes scanning the dark tree line. Grace watched how she faced it, all instinct and alertness. There was something soulful in that stance, a reminder that fear and courage live in the same body. Now and then, Grace would explain a little to the occasional visitor, especially the older ones who lingered longer. "Bobcats are solitary," she'd say. "They roam miles of territory. They're not meant to be pets."
This, and she'd gesture to Hazel's enclosure with its logs and platforms and quiet corners, is a compromise. It's not the wild, but it's safe.
It's a place she can be herself, without cars and traps and gunshots. Sometimes she'd see a familiar look in their eyes, that mix of sadness and gratitude. Because most of us, by that age, know what it feels like to live somewhere that's not quite the life we imagined, but still a place where we can breathe. Hazel became more than the bobcat in the side enclosure. She became a kind of anchor for the center. Margaret, the older volunteer, liked to bring her fallen bird feathers or dried seed heads to tuck into her enrichment logs. Blair would stop by after cleaning the raptor mews just to watch Hazel nap in the sun, tail twitching. For Grace, Hazel became a quiet center of gravity, a reminder that love doesn't have to look like ownership to be real, that kindness can flow through a fence just as surely as it does across a kitchen table. That loyalty can exist between two beings who don't share a language, but share a space, day after day. Looking back, it's easy to say they were meant for each other, to turn their story into one of those moral stories we tell ourselves, about fate and second chances. But at the time, it was just one morning after another, one cup of coffee. One bobcat is waiting on a rock, one woman choosing to show up. And for a long time, that was enough to make them both quietly happy. If you've ever had a routine like that, a walk at the same hour, a chair by the same window, a dog or cat or wild visitor who just shows up with you, you know how deep those roots can go, how much they hold you when the rest of life feels unsteady. For years, High Ridge moved to that rhythm. The seasons changed. Hazel's coat thickened and thinned. Gray crept into the fur around her mouth. Grace's hands grew a little stiffer on cold mornings, but she still wrapped them around that same blue mug. Until the day Hazel left half her breakfast in the bowl. It was a small thing, easy to dismiss, but it was the first loose thread in a tapestry they'd spent 6 years quietly weaving together. If your heart is with them now, with the woman on the log and the bobcat on the rock, stay close, because in the next part of this story, we'll step into the season when Hazel's body starts sending signals no one can quite read. And Grace has to decide how far love and loyalty are willing to go. The first sign that something was wrong with Hazel was small enough to ignore. One morning, Grace set down the metal bowl just inside the shift gate, like she always did. Rabbit, a few pieces of quail, a little supplement the vet had recommended for Hazel's joints. For 6 years, that sound of stainless steel on concrete had brought Hazel trotting in from wherever she was, tail flicking, eyes bright. That day, Hazel walked over, sniffed once, and turned away. It could have been anything, Grace told herself. Maybe Hazel had found a mouse earlier. Maybe she was just off her feed for a day. Animals have moods too. But it felt like the tiniest stone dropping into a still pond. A faint ripple that didn't look like much on the surface but kept moving outward. Over the next few weeks, the ripples spread. Hazel missed her perch once, just once. She jumped for her favorite flat rock in the corner of the enclosure, misjudged, and slid down with a thump that made Grace's heart stop. Hazel got up quickly, pretending nothing had happened, in that dignified bobcat way. But her hind legs looked slow, a fraction of a beat behind the rest of her. "It's probably age," Grace told Margaret, watching Hazel pace along the fence line. "Or maybe she twisted something. They get old the same as we do," Margaret said. "Joints, muscles, all of it." They both wanted to believe that. It would have been a simple, happy explanation. The kind you find in fairy tales and easy moral stories, where the problem fits neatly into a single sentence. But bodies don't always tell simple stories. Hazel started sleeping more. Not just that heavy midday nap Bobcats love, belly full, sun warm. This was different. She skipped playtime with the hanging rope and her favorite log stuffed with herbs. On windy days, when she usually stood alert, reading the air, she stayed tucked in the back of her den, eyes half closed, breathing just a little faster than normal. One afternoon, Grace watched Hazel walk the perimeter and noticed her back toes dragging barely, leaving faint lines in the packed dirt. To anyone else, they might have looked like nothing. To someone who had memorized this animal's every movement out of love and loyalty, they were loud. She called Maria. The first exam was simple. Blood draw, physical check, palpating along the spine, listening to the heart and lungs. Hazel tolerated it with her usual wary patience, ears angled, eyes on Grace the whole time. "A little underweight," Maria said, frowning at the chart. "And that rear end weakness you mentioned. It could be a spinal issue, could be metabolic, could be a lot of things." She ordered basic blood panels, the kind every vet starts with. Grace nodded, arms folded tight against her chest as if she were trying to hold her own worry in place. If you've ever sat in a waiting room while someone runs tests on a body you love, you know how time shifts. Minutes stretch and then snap back. You notice little things you've never seen before. A scuff on the floor, a crooked picture frame, the way the light hits a dust mote. Because you're trying not to think about the one thing you can't control. The initial results came back interesting, which is not a word you want to hear in medicine. Some markers that looked like inflammation, some that hinted at nerve involvement. Nothing you could point to and say, "Here, this is it." No obvious infection, no clear trauma, just a pattern that made everyone tilt their heads and say, "Huh." Maria explained it to Grace carefully. "Think of Hazel's nervous system like a highway," she said, drawing a quick sketch on a scrap of paper. "Messages go from her brain down her spine out to her muscles. Right now, somewhere along that highway, traffic isn't moving the way it should." "Is it blocked?" Grace asked. "Maybe," Maria said. "Or maybe there's something in the way. Or the road itself is damaged. We don't know yet." They sent more blood out to a bigger lab in Denver, then to a university breakdown panel. Each time, the answer came back with more questions attached. Words like degenerative, progressive, and neurologic began to appear in email subjects. It's hard to describe what those words do to you when you're already carrying old grief. For Grace, they rang uncomfortably close to the language doctors had used years earlier with her husband. Back then, too, the first signs had been small. A little forgetfulness, a stumble, a scan with gray areas that the specialist couldn't quite explain. She'd watched the way the medical staff spoke in careful, measured tones, offering just enough information to be honest without taking away all hope. Now she was hearing that same steady cadence in Maria's voice. "We should prepare for the possibility," Maria said finally, sitting across from her in the tiny office with its bulletin board of animals past and present. "There are conditions in wild carnivores that act a lot like the human prion diseases you've probably heard about. They're rare, but when they happen, they look like this. Loss of coordination, behavior changes, weight loss." "So what do we do?" Grace asked. Maria's eyes were tired, but kind. "We rule out everything else we can. We look for treatable causes, infections, toxins, nutritional deficiencies. If we can't find anything we can fix, we talk about what's kindest for her. Not for us, for her." It wasn't the inspirational story Grace wanted. It wasn't a heartwarming story you could wrap up with a bow, but it was honest. They checked Hazel's enclosure from top to bottom. Water, food, substrate, plants, anything that might have introduced something harmful. Blair walked every inch of the perimeter fence, checking for stray wires, old nails, anything that could have caused an injury. Grace found herself watching Hazel even more closely, counting every step when she walked from the den to the rock, timing how long she spent at the water bowl, noticing when her purr, that deep, rough rumble, took longer to start. One cold morning, Hazel tried to jump up on her favorite perch and didn't make it. She hit the side awkwardly, slid down, And this time she didn't bounce right back up. She lay there for a moment, sides heaving, eyes unfocused. Grace stepped toward the gate, heart pounding, instinct screaming to run in, scoop Hazel up, hold her like she used to hold that little bottle baby. But Hazel was not a pet. She was still a bobcat, with claws and teeth and a wild soul that deserved respect. So Grace did the kindest thing she could. She crouched at the fence, voice steady, giving Hazel something familiar to anchor to, while the bobcat gathered herself and slowly, shakily, stood up again. That scene stayed with her, a powerful animal on the ground, struggling to remember how to be what she'd always been. It touched a very human nerve too. How many of us have had a moment like that, physically or emotionally, where something that used to be easy suddenly felt impossible? The specialists were polite and thorough. The language became more technical. Terms like rapidly progressive neurologic syndrome, poor prognosis, and highly suggestive started appearing in reports. One email from a researcher Grace didn't know in another state mentioned a test that could distinguish between certain types of brain disease and some fungal infections that can imitate them. But the test wasn't widely available. Results would take time. The disease, if that's what it was, would not wait. Science, for all its brilliance, sometimes moves more slowly than the body's decline. In the middle of all that uncertainty, one truth stood very still. Hazel was getting worse. She stumbled more often. She stopped playing. She began to look past the fence instead of pacing along it, like she was losing interest in the world on the other side. There's a strange loneliness in hearing, "We don't know exactly what this is, but we think we know how it ends." It's not the sharp shock of bad news. It's a slow drip. It seeps into your routines, your sleep, your quiet moments with a cup of tea. Grace started waking up at 3 a.m., listening for sounds from Hazel's enclosure through the dark. She'd lie there, remembering all the quiet, happy mornings when the biggest question was whether to give Hazel a rabbit or a quail, and wonder how they had ended up here, in a story that didn't feel like any of the comforting fairy tales she'd grown up with. This was something else, a soulful, complicated chapter where kindness and love didn't have a clear script to follow. If you've ever been in that place, hovering between maybe it's nothing and maybe it's everything, you know it wears on you. It tests your loyalty not just to the one you love, but to your own ability to keep showing up when there are no easy answers. And yet, that's where the next part of this journey lives. Because as Hazel's symptoms grew harder to ignore, a new kind of pressure crept in, not just from the disease, but from policies, from ethics, from the question every rehabber dreads. At what point does keeping an animal alive stop being kindness and start being cruelty? If your heart is walking beside Grace and Hazel right now, stay with them. In the next part, we'll sit with that question in the quiet of the office at High Ridge, where a stack of printed guidelines, a history of old goodbyes, and one bobcat's fading strength push Grace toward the hardest promise she's ever had to consider. Some promises feel easy when you make them. I'll take care of you. You're safe now. They sound simple in the glow of a good day. It's only later, in a small office at the edge of a sleeping valley, that you realize what those words might really cost. The office at High Ridge is quiet, except for the hum of the old fridge and the ticking of a plastic clock. It's late. The volunteers have gone home. The raptors are settled. Snow taps lightly at the window. Grace sits at the desk with the state wildlife guidelines spread out in front of her. Printed pages, highlighted sections, sticky notes. Her reading glasses sit halfway down her nose. Her coffee's gone cold. On the top page, a phrase is underlined in blue pen. Humane euthanasia is recommended when an animal has a progressive, untreatable condition with poor quality of life and no reasonable expectation of recovery. She reads it again, as if the words might change if she just looks at them hard enough. In a way, it's clear. In wildlife rehab, you don't prolong suffering because you're afraid to lose what you love. You don't keep a bobcat alive just because you can't imagine the enclosure without her. The moral stories in the training manuals are firm about that. Kindness, they say, sometimes means letting go. But paper doesn't have a heartbeat. It doesn't remember the way Hazel's eyes used to light up when she caught a new smell on the wind, or the rough, rumbling purr when Grace sat down beside the fence on a quiet morning. Guidelines don't feel what it's like to watch someone you love struggle to stand up. Grace leans back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "She's falling more," Maria had said that afternoon. "The stumbling, the confusion. It's getting worse. We've ruled out everything we can realistically treat." "What if we're wrong?" Grace had asked. "What if there's something we missed?" Maria hadn't snapped. She never did. She just looked tired, the way people look when they've had this conversation more than once in their careers. "We'll always worry about that," she said. "But there comes a point when every day is harder for them than it is for us. And then we have to ask who we're keeping them alive for." Now, alone in the office, Grace hears that line echoing. Who is this really for? She glances up at the bulletin board. Photos of animals stare back. A fox released under the moonlight, an owl returning to the sky. In the corner is a faded picture of a young wolf staring through a chain link, eyes clouded. Maria keeps that one there on purpose. She'd told Grace the story once, voice softer than usual. "We had a wolf, years ago," she said. "Different center. Neurologic signs, like Hazel. We weren't sure. We let it go on too long because nobody could bear to make the call. It got bad at the end, really bad." She didn't share all the details. She didn't have to. Grace understood. That image lives behind every decision they make now. The clock clicks over to 10:47. Grace picks up a pen, sets it down again. She opens her notebook and writes 3 words on a blank page. "I promised her." When Hazel came in as a half-starved Bobcat kitten shaking in that crate, Grace had leaned down and whispered, "You're safe now." It hadn't been about fairy tales or happy endings. It had been about loyalty, about taking responsibility. What does safe mean, she wonders now, when the body itself has become dangerous? She closes the file folder and stands up. The room feels too small, her thoughts too loud. She pulls on her coat and steps out into the dark. The night at High Ridge is wide and cold. Stars burn through thin clouds. The pines shift and murmur. In Hazel's enclosure, a single low-watt bulb casts a soft pool of light over the den entrance. Grace walks to the fence, boots crunching softly. Hazel is lying just inside the doorway, head up but drooping, watching. "Hey, sweetheart," Grace says, hands wrapped around the chain link. Her breath fogs the air. Hazel blinks slowly, pupils wide, then pushes herself to standing. For a moment, it looks normal. Just Hazel walking toward her. Then one back leg doesn't quite cooperate. She wobbles, catches herself, tries again. Her body knows what it wants to do. The signals just don't all arrive on time. It's a small scene, over in seconds, but to Grace, watching, it feels like the ground shifting under her feet. She remembers the doctor at her husband's bedside, all those years ago, explaining that machines were keeping his body going when his brain was already gone. "We can continue," he'd said gently, "but it won't change the outcome. It will only change how long he has to struggle." She'd sat in that chair, hand on her husband's, feeling like a traitor for even considering turning the machines off. And yet, she'd done it. Out of love. Out of a belief deep down that love is not the same thing as clinging. Now, here she is again. Different building, different species. Same impossible feeling. Hazel reaches the fence and touches her nose to the mesh. Grace holds out her hand, palm flat. The Bobcat presses into it, eyes half closing, that rough purr starting up deep in her chest. Even now, with her body failing, she still leans into the familiar. Grace's eyes sting. "You've been the best girl," she whispers. "You've given so much." She doesn't say, "I don't know what to do," but the words hang there anyway, visible in the cold air. She stays like that for a long time, hand on the fence, Hazel breathing slowly on the other side. Above them, the stars continue their quiet, ancient work. Finally, she speaks out loud, not just to Hazel. "If she has to go," Grace says to the night, to the pines, to whatever might be listening, "let it be peaceful. If there's any way she can stay, show us. Open a door I can't see yet." It's not a formal prayer, it's just a tired woman asking for a little guidance. On her way back to the office, she pauses at a fence post and sets a small, smooth stone on top. She doesn't know why. It just feels right. A tiny marker, a way of saying, "I'm paying attention." The next morning, the decision is made. Maria meets her in the office, chart in hand, eyes steady. "If we schedule for tomorrow," she says quietly, "we can adjust her meds today so she's as comfortable as possible. We can give her a good last day. Sunday. Quiet. Favorite foods, then the sedative, then the rest." Grace feels her chest tighten. "Tomorrow," she repeats. She almost says, "Let's wait a week." But then she thinks of Hazel's stumble, the confusion in her eyes, the emails full of phrases like rapid progression and poor quality of life. She thinks of the wolf in Maria's story and how much that regret still weighs. Her voice comes out smaller than she means it to. "Okay, tomorrow." Maria reaches across the desk, lays a hand over Grace's for just a second. "This is love," she says softly. "The hard kind. The kind that looks like letting go." Blair appears in the doorway later, face pale. "I'll be there," they say. Their voice wobbles. "For Hazel. For you." Grace nods. "We'll make it as gentle as we can," she replies. "She deserves that." There's nothing happy about this plan, but there is something deeply human in it. A willingness to put Hazel's comfort ahead of their own need to keep her here. A quiet, soulful act of kindness that doesn't look like the love scenes in movies, but might be the purest form of loyalty they can offer. That afternoon, Grace walks back out to Hazel's enclosure with a fresh blanket and a pocket full of dried leaves Hazel always liked to sniff. The sky is pale, the sun thin but present. A raven calls from the far hill. Tomorrow, she thinks, we say goodbye. She doesn't know that an email is already moving through the digital world toward them. She doesn't know that someone far away is about to look at Hazel's test results and see something everyone else missed. Tonight, all she knows is that she has made the hardest promise a caretaker can make: to love someone enough to let them rest. If you've ever had to make a decision like that, for a pet, a parent, a partner, you know how heavy it sits in your chest. You also know how much courage it takes to follow through. Stay with this story, if you can, because in the next part, on the very morning Hazel is supposed to leave this world, love, loyalty, and one unexpected message will collide in a way no one at High Ridge could have imagined. The morning Hazel was scheduled to die began almost too beautifully. Sunlight came in low over the ridge, catching on the frost and turning the whole field behind the clinic into a sheet of pale gold. You wouldn't have guessed that inside the main building, a small room had already been quietly set aside for goodbye. Grace arrived long before anyone else. She wanted time. She set a soft blanket on the padded floor of the treatment room, smoothing out every wrinkle, as if comfort could be folded into the fabric. She brought in Hazel's favorite toy, a rabbit fur pouch that still held the faint scent of herbs, and placed it where Hazel's nose could find it. A bowl of water, a handful of quail pieces just in case. Then she went to get Hazel. Hazel walked slowly down the covered walkway, enclosed on both sides, the way she always did when they had to move her. The disease had taken so much of her coordination, but not all of her dignity. Grace walked alongside the crate, one hand resting on the metal, talking in a voice she hoped sounded steadier than she felt. "We're going to the quiet room today, Hazel," she murmured. "Warm blanket, just you and me." There's a particular tenderness in the way we prepare for a last day. A favorite meal, a favorite walk. Special care is taken with every small thing. It's a kind of love that has nothing to do with fairy tales and everything to do with loyalty. Maria and Blair were waiting when they arrived. They dimmed the overhead light a little. Someone had thought to turn on a small radio in the corner, low volume, an instrumental station that made the room feel less clinical and more like a living room. Maria spoke gently, partly to Grace, partly to herself. "First, we'll give the sedative," she said, holding up the clear syringe. "It'll make her very sleepy. She won't be anxious. When she's fully under, we'll finish. She won't feel that part at all." Grace had heard versions of that speech before, with a family dog, with her father. In each case, the words had been meant as kindness. This time, they still were, but they landed on a heart already layered with older losses. She knelt on the floor beside Hazel, who was now lying on the blanket, breathing faster than usual. The Bobcat's eyes never left her face. For a few minutes, the room was quiet. Grace let her hand rest on Hazel's side, feeling the rise and fall. Hazel's fur was still thick, still beautiful in its own way. The illness hadn't taken that. Grace thought about all the moral stories she'd heard over the years about doing the right thing when an animal is suffering. They were usually told with clean endings, quick lessons. None of them had prepared her for how this actually felt. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Maria moved closer, syringe ready. Blair stood a little behind, hands clasped tightly, watching. "Okay," Maria said softly. "Grace, I'm going to reach for her leg now. You just keep talking to her." She reached out for Hazel's front leg, searching gently for a vein. That's when everything changed. It happened in a few seconds, but it felt longer. Hazel gathered herself up, as if from a very deep place. Her muscles trembled with the effort. Instead of letting Maria lift her paw, she pushed up on both front legs and lurched forward. Grace instinctively put her arms out, thinking Hazel was falling. But Hazel didn't fall. She wrapped both front legs around Grace's shoulders and pulled herself in. It was not a graceful motion. It was clumsy, heavy, and almost desperate. Hazel's chest pressed against Grace's. Her chin came to rest in the hollow of Grace's collarbone. Her face burrowed into the side of Grace's neck, whiskers brushing skin. Her claws stayed sheathed. She held on. Grace froze, breath caught halfway. Then her hands moved on their own, sliding around Hazel's body the way you might cradle a child or a friend who has just heard bad news. She could feel every bony ridge under that spotted coat. She could feel Hazel's heart hammering. A low sound came from Hazel's throat. Not a hiss, not the steady purr of a happy animal, but something rough and shaky. A sound full of emotions that don't fit into human language. Maria's hand stopped in midair. The syringe hovered for a second, then dropped a fraction of an inch as her grip loosened. "Oh," she breathed. That was all she trusted herself to say. Blair's eyes were wet. They had seen a lot in their first years at High Ridge. Foxes snarling, birds fighting sedation. But they had never seen a bobcat hug anyone like this. Time thinned out in that room. For a moment it felt like there were only two beings in the world. A woman who had promised to protect a wild animal, and a bobcat who in her weakest moment was holding on to the person she trusted most. If you've ever had an animal press into you like that, a dog putting its head under your hand, a cat sleeping on your chest, a horse resting its forehead against yours, you know that it does something strange to the soul. It bypasses words. It asks questions without asking them. Are you sure? Are you really sure it has to be today? Maria lowered the syringe completely. Her professional training, her knowledge of the disease, everything she'd read in those reports, none of it vanished, but something new had entered the room. Doubt, shaped by love. "I can't," she whispered. "Not while she's looking at you like that. Not without checking one more time." Just then, Blair's phone, forgotten on the countertop, buzzed. Normally, they'd have ignored it. In a moment like this, nothing outside the room should have mattered. But the sound was oddly loud in the quiet. A second buzz followed, the little device skating a few inches on the metal. "Sorry," Blair muttered, stepping over to silence it. They glanced at the screen. Then their face changed. "Maria," they said, voice suddenly thin. "You need to see this." On the phone, at the top of a new email, a subject line glowed. "Re Hazel. Urgent. Possible misdiagnosis. Do not proceed with euthanasia." Maria felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She took the phone, hands almost as unsteady as Hazel's legs had been, and tapped the message open. The email was from a name she recognized. Justice Rivers, a wildlife disease specialist at Green Hollow Institute back east. They had forwarded Hazel's confusing lab work to him days ago, almost as an afterthought. No one had expected such a quick, firm response. She read aloud enough for everyone to understand. "He's seen this pattern before. Coyotes? A young mountain lion? It can look exactly like a prion-type disease on standard tests. But in some cases..." She stopped, breathing once, deeply. "In some cases, it's a systemic fungal infection. Treatable. Long road, but treatable." She scrolled further. "He says the primary test we used is notorious for false positives in younger carnivores. He's begging us not to euthanize until we rule out the fungal option." The room seemed to exhale. Grace didn't let go of Hazel. Hazel didn't let go of Grace. But something inside her chest shifted, like a window cracked open in a stuffy house. "So she might not be dying from a brain disease?" Grace asked, voice barely above a whisper. "She's still very sick," Maria said carefully. "If this is a fungal infection, it's in her whole system, in her nerves. It won't be an easy fix. Months of medication, monitoring, maybe more." She looked up from the phone, eyes shining for the first time in weeks, with something that wasn't only sorrow. "But if he's right, we haven't reached the end." "Not yet." In that small room, it was as if two moral stories were colliding. One about the kindness of letting go when there truly is no hope. Another about the courage of asking one more question when a tiny door of possibility opens. Sometimes, love isn't either or. It's both. Willing to release, willing to fight, depending on what kindness requires. Hazel finally loosened her hold, muscles too tired to keep clinging. She slumped back onto the blanket, breathing hard, eyes still locked on Grace. The Bobcat didn't know a researcher had just typed out an email for her. She only knew that the person she trusted was still there, still choosing her. Grace wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What do we need to do?" she asked, looking at Maria and Blair. Her voice had changed. It had a new thread in it, thin but real, that sounded like hope. Maria glanced at the phone again, scanning the next lines. "He wants us to get Hazel to him," she said slowly. "Green Hollow Wildlife Institute, upstate New York. He can run the specialized tests there, confirm the diagnosis, start treatment if it's what he thinks." "New York," Grace repeated. That was halfway across the country. Permits, transport, money they didn't really have. All the reasons to say no lined up in her mind. Then she looked down at Hazel, at the Bobcat, who had just spent the last of her strength on a final hug that might not be final after all. "Then we get her there," she said. "We figure it out." It wasn't a dramatic declaration, just a steady statement from someone who had been walking alongside this animal for 6 years and wasn't ready to stop if there was a chance to keep going. If you've ever been in that moment, standing between what the experts say and what your heart hopes, you know it can feel like trying to walk on water. But sometimes, one careful step at a time, we find that there's more ground under us than we thought. In the next part of this story, that's exactly what Grace and Hazel do. They leave the safety of their valley and carry their fragile hope across miles of winter highway toward a quiet institute among eastern pines. If your heart is still with them, I'd invite you to stay close as we follow that journey. It's not flashy, it's not fast, but it is one of those quiet, inspirational stories where kindness, love, and loyalty turn a road trip into something close to a soulful pilgrimage. There's a moment, right after you decide to fight for someone, when the world feels both bigger and smaller at the same time. Bigger, because suddenly you're thinking in miles and maps and possibilities. Smaller, because your whole focus narrows to one breathing body and what it will take to keep that breath going.
That's what it was like the day Grace agreed to carry Hazel, the sick bobcat who just hugged her goodbye, across the country.
The hours after the email from Green Hollow were a blur of action, held together by one quiet thought. We might have another way. Maria got on the phone with state wildlife officials, explaining the situation 3 different times in 3 different ways. Hazel was a non-releasable bobcat, a Category 4 animal. Transporting her across state lines wasn't as simple as loading a dog into a car. There's a specialist in New York, Maria said, pacing the office. We have lab work suggesting a misdiagnosis. If this is a fungal infection and not a neurological collapse, we owe it to her to try. There was paperwork. There were questions. There were polite voices on the phone reminding them that wild animals aren't usually moved for treatment like pets. Often, the kind option is euthanasia. But every time the conversation wavered, Maria would say,
"We have an expert saying this is treatable."
and Grace would glance at Hazel resting in her crate and remember the weight of that hug. Loyalty steadied them both. By evening, they had a provisional interstate permit and a plan. They couldn't afford a full cargo flight setup, and the weather made air travel risky anyway. Instead, a small regional foundation stepped in. They loaned them a compact veterinary van with climate control and space to secure Hazel's crate. Grace called Nora, the park ranger she'd known since her 20s. I have to drive a very sick bobcat to upstate New York, she said, voice shaking just a little. Tonight, or as close to tonight as we can. What's the route? Nora asked without missing a beat. I'm coming. They left before dawn the next morning. The van's headlights cut through the lingering dark as they rolled away from High Ridge. Margaret stood by the gate, hands stuffed in her coat pockets, breath puffing white in the cold. Bring our girl back, she called, if you can. Hazel lay sedated but lightly monitored in the reinforced crate. A soft blanket lined the floor, another draped over the top to block drafts. A portable heart monitor, a small concession from a sympathetic vet in town, displayed a slow, steady rhythm in green numbers. Grace sat in the back for the first stretch, one hand on the crate, feeling the faint motion of Hazel's breathing through the metal. Nora drove, eyes on the road, the landscape slowly lifting out of shadow. Montana's pines faded into rolling plains as the hours passed. Fields of winter grass stretched out on either side, tan and silver under the low sun. Every so often, Grace would glance up and catch the reflection of the sky in the van's window, that endless bowl of blue that made her feel both very small and strangely held. We're really doing this, she said softly. Nora smiled in the rearview mirror. We've done crazier things for less deserving souls, she replied. This one? She's worth the miles. There was nothing dramatic about the drive. No sirens, no screeching tires, just the hum of the engine, the occasional rattle of a road seam, the soft beep of Hazel's monitor. But inside that ordinary travel sat something deeply soulful. A quiet, determined act of kindness. They stopped at a truck stop somewhere in the Midwest late that night, the kind of place where the coffee is always a little burned and the floor is always a little sticky. Grace checked Hazel first, as she did at every stop. Breathe still, even, heart rate holding. A little twitch in one paw when the van door opened and new air came in. Inside, standing in line for coffee, Grace felt the kind of bone-deep tired that has nothing to do with sleep. It was the weight of a long life's worth of emotions layered over a single, fragile hope. An older woman ahead of her glanced at the High Ridge logo on her jacket. Long day? The woman asked. Grace let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Long couple of months, she said. We've got a sick bobcat in the van, taking her to a specialist. The woman's eyes softened. I once drove 6 hours with a cat who could barely breathe, she said. Vet said it was probably pointless. Turned out to be something they could fix. He gave me 3 more years of that grumpy old thing yelling at me from the windowsill. She chuckled, then grew quiet. Even if it hadn't worked, she added, I think I would have slept better knowing I tried. Love's like that, isn't it? Grace nodded, throat thick. Sometimes the moral stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones in books, They're the offhand confessions we hear in coffee lines at midnight.
Back at High Ridge, the absence had its own shape.
Margaret Greatest found herself walking past Hazel's empty enclosure more often than necessary, pausing at the gate without quite realizing it. The center sounded different too.
The hawks still called, the fox still rustled in his den,
But there was a missing rhythm. The steady pacing of Hazel's feet along the perimeter, the low chirp when she spotted Grace's boots. She started leaving small tokens on Hazel's favorite rock. A pine cone, a feather, a smooth stone from the creek. Little markers of loyalty, as if to say, "We haven't forgotten you. This is still your place."
For viewers who have cared for animals or people across distance, that gesture might feel familiar. We light candles. We keep a room tidy. We talk to photographs. Love keeps acting, even when the one we love is far away. As the van crossed state lines, the scenery changed again. Plains gave way to low hills. Then the hills grew trees. By the time they entered New York, bare branches arched over the highway like old hands. The air felt different when they stopped. Heavier, wetter, holding a sweetness of leaf mold and distant water.
"Smells like home to you?"
Nora asked, stretching stiff legs. Grace inhaled.
"Smells like someplace new," she said. "For both of us."
There was something quietly inspirational in that thought. A bobcat born in a dry, rocky landscape, about to step, carefully, cautiously, into an eastern world of lakes and maples and soft ground. Not in a fairy tale way where animals go on adventures, in a very real, very fragile way, carried by human hands, trying to correct a human mistake. They turned off the highway onto a smaller road, then onto an even smaller one, gravel crunching under the tires. A modest wooden sign appeared at the bend. Green Hollow Wildlife Institute. No fanfare, no big gates, just a long driveway curving around a small lake, a cluster of low buildings nestled among trees. The van rolled to a stop near a side entrance.
A few figures waited outside, bundled against the chill. One stepped forward, hand raised in greeting. That would be Justice Rivers, the specialist whose email had turned a goodbye into a maybe. Grace didn't feel triumphant as she stepped out of the van. She felt relieved and scared and deeply grateful that the distance between "nothing more we can do" and "let's take another look" could be crossed by something as simple as wheels and willingness. She went to Hazel's crate, resting her palm against the metal. "We made it," she whispered. "Now we let them see what's really going on in there." If you've ever arrived at a hospital or clinic after a long trip with someone you love, you know that strange mix of exhaustion and thin hope. For a moment, all you can do is breathe and trust that you've brought them to the right place. In the next part of this story, that's what we'll step into together. The quiet halls of Green Hollow, the careful hands of a new team, and the science that will finally tell Grace whether this journey was a detour or the start of a very different, very heartwarming chapter in Hazel's life. If your heart has been traveling with them so far, I'd invite you to stay close. The road has brought them here for a reason. Now we get to see what that reason really is. The place that might tell them they've been wrong about Hazel didn't look like a miracle. It looked like a low building tucked between tall pines, mist rising off a small lake, and a hand-painted sign that simply read, Green Hollow Wildlife Institute. No trumpets, no crowds, just a gravel driveway, a cold breeze, and the quiet hope that after all these miles, someone here could finally give this bobcat an honest answer. Justice Rivers met them at the side entrance, calm and practical. He didn't waste time. While Grace signed the last transport forms with stiff, travel-sore fingers, his team was already easing Hazel's crate onto a rolling cart, checking the monitor, speaking in low, steady voices. Inside, the main treatment room smelled of disinfectant and cedar shavings. Soft light, no harsh glare. Hazel's crate was opened just enough for the team to slide her onto a padded table, then into a larger, comfortable pen where she could rest without feeling cornered. Grace stood just outside the gate, fingers curled around the metal, watching every move. Justice spoke as he worked, not rushing, not dramatizing. "I've read everything you sent," he said.
The test results you got back. I understand why your vets thought neurological disease. On paper, it fits.
He glanced at Hazel, then back at Grace.
But in the last few years, we've seen a few cases that looked just like this and turned out to be something else.
He reached for a marker and sketched a quick line on the whiteboard. A simple drawing of a brain, a spine, a path.
Think of the nervous system like a highway, he said. Messages travel from the brain to the muscles, like cars going from one town to another.
In true prion-type disease, the road itself is collapsing. Bridges are falling. There's no way through.
He drew a second line, a little messy, with squiggles and detours.
In some of these rare fungal infections, the road is still there, but fog rolls in. Debris piles up. Traffic slows or stops in places. It looks the same from the outside. Stumbling, confusion, weakness. But the cause is different. And if it's fungus, we sometimes have a chance to clear the road.
Grace listened, holding Hazel's gaze through the mesh.
She thought about all the labels that had landed in her inbox over the last months. Degenerative, progressive, no known treatment. They had sounded like closed doors. Now, for the first time, someone was saying there might be more to the story. So how do we know which one it is? She asked. Justice smiled just a little. We look closer, he said, with better tools. The rest of that day unfolded like a careful ritual. Blood was drawn again, but this time with additional vials for specialized panels. Imaging was done with machines more advanced than anything at High Ridge, screens tracing out delicate shapes of brain and spine.
At one point, Hazel underwent a spinal tap, a word that made Grace's stomach knot, until Justice explained it quietly, step by step, in plain language.
Hazel handled it all with the same tired patience she'd shown back home. The sedatives took her under smoothly. Each time she came back to herself, eyes blinking, she would search the room until she found Grace's shape and settle a little.
In the waiting spaces between procedures, the Institute showed its heart.
They offered Grace and Nora a small room upstairs,
2 bunks, a narrow window with a view of the lake.
In the staff kitchen that evening, they sat around a scarred wooden table with bowls of chili and cornbread, sharing stories. One vet nurse talked about a bald eagle brought in with a wing shattered by a bullet. Another mentioned a fox who had come in with mange and left months later, sleek and sharp-eyed. Not every tale had a happy ending, but every one of them carried the same thread of kindness, of people trying to tip the balance a little toward mercy. Justice's old dog wandered in halfway through the meal, tail wagging slowly. He made his way over to Hazel's pen in the adjoining room, sniffed carefully, then lay down right beside the mesh, body curved along Hazel's like a protective comma. Seeing that simple, quiet companionship, dog outside the pen, Bobcat inside, both just breathing in sync, did something gentle to Grace's heart. It reminded her that love and loyalty aren't limited by species. They're choices, made over and over in small, steady ways. That night, in the upper bunk, Grace stared at the ceiling long after the lights were out. Below her, Nora shifted, then whispered into the dark. You awake? Yeah, Grace murmured. What are you most afraid of right now? Nora asked. It wasn't a challenge, just a soft question, offered like a hand. Grace thought about it. I'm afraid we dragged her all this way for nothing, she said. That they'll confirm the first diagnosis, and I'll have to say goodbye to her here, in a place she doesn't know, without her rock, without her valley. There was a rustle of blankets, then Nora's voice again. You brought her to the one place that might save her, she said. Even if it doesn't work out the way we want, that's still love. That's still loyalty. That matters. In another kind of story, maybe a slicker, shinier one, this would be the moment where someone promises everything will be fine. But life, and good storytelling, don't always work like fairy tales. Sometimes the most comforting words are honest ones. Whatever happens, you kept your promise the best way you knew how. The next morning, the lake was wrapped in thin fog, and the trees reflected in the still water. Grace walked with Hazel just outside the clinic doors, a secure harness cradling the Bobcat's fragile body.
Hazel's paws stepped onto damp ground she'd never smelled before, her nose lifting to read this new air. For a brief moment, despite the weakness, there was a glimmer of the old curiosity in her eyes. Then she tired, leaned her weight against Grace's leg, and allowed herself to be carried back inside. By late morning, the tests were done. Machines had hummed and spun and beeped. Samples had been amplified, stained, and studied. Now there was nothing to do but wait while the final analysis processed. Grace sat in a small office with Justice and Nora, a mug of coffee cooling in her hands. Every time a printer somewhere in the building sputtered to life, her heart jumped. At last, it was their printer. A thin strip of paper slid out, covered in codes and numbers and small graphs that looked like a foreign language. Justice took it, studying it in silence. He didn't rush. His eyes moved line by line. Grace watched him instead of the page. It's a habit you pick up when you've sat through enough medical appointments. The answer shows up on the face before it reaches the mouth. For a long moment, nothing changed. Then the corners of his eyes softened. A real smile, slow and relieved, tugged at his mouth. He looked up. "Well," he said, voice warm, just a little rough. "Hazel does not have an irreversible neurological disease." Grace's knees nearly gave out. Nora's hand was on her arm in an instant. Justice continued. "The pattern matches a very specific systemic fungal infection we've seen a few times. It infiltrates the nervous system, mimics those prion-like signs, and even tricks some of the basic tests. But with the right antifungal treatment, careful monitoring of her organs, and time, we can manage this. It won't be easy, but we have a path." He pointed to a section of the printout, then to a chart pinned on the wall explaining in gentle detail how the fungal markers lined up, how the false positives in younger carnivores can happen, how the more targeted test had finally teased out the truth. For viewers who have ever sought a second opinion, this part of the story may touch a familiar place. It's not about shaming the first doctors. It's about honoring the complexity of bodies and the value of someone willing to look one layer deeper. Tears blurred Grace's vision. She reached out without thinking and hugged Justice. He seemed a little surprised, then hugged her back, a small laugh catching in his throat. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing what everyone else couldn't." On the way out of the office, she went straight to Hazel's pen. The Bobcat, sensing the shift, rose unsteadily and walked to the mesh. Her eyes looked clearer, or maybe that was just the way Grace was seeing her now. Not as a patient on the edge of goodbye, but as a fighter at the beginning of a long, uncertain, but possible road. Grace rested her forehead against the wire. Hazel pressed hers to the same spot. No dramatic hug this time, just a simple, shared breath. "We're not done, you and me," Grace said. "We've got more waking up to do. More mornings, more stories." Behind her, Justice outlined the plan. Hazel would stay at Green Hollow for several weeks of intensive treatment. IV antifungals, supportive meds, nutritional support. If she stabilized, they'd shift to oral medications, periodic checkups, and eventually clear her to go home to High Ridge, with a detailed schedule and a phone line always open. It wouldn't be a quick, tidy, happily ever after. It would be a long, careful chapter, full of tiny victories and inevitable scares. But that's what real, heartwarming stories often look like. Not magic wands, just people and animals choosing each other, one day at a time. If you've ever come through a health scare, your own or someone else's, you know how powerful that first real breath of relief can be. It doesn't erase the fear, it just makes room beside it for gratitude. In the final part of this story, we're going to step forward 6 months and see what that gratitude looks like in Hazel's life. And in Grace's. How a bobcat who once hugged her caretaker goodbye ends up napping on a familiar rock again. And how one woman learns to hold on, not out of fear, but out of thankfulness for every extra day. If your heart has followed them all the way to Green Hollow, I'd invite you to stay for that last chapter. It's quiet, it's simple, and in its own way, it might be the most inspirational part of all. 6 months later,
If you drove past High Ridge on a clear morning, you'd think nothing out of the ordinary was happening. The pines still held their silent watch. The gravel still crunched under the tires of the feed truck. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney of the little office. You'd never guess that on this quiet piece of land, there was a bobcat who had once hugged her caretaker goodbye, and was now, slowly, writing a different kind of miracle with every careful step she took. Hazel's enclosure looks the same at first glance. The same big rock in the corner, the same deadfall logs are arranged for climbing, the same patch of ground where she likes to roll when the dust is warm. But if you watch closely, there are small differences that only someone who loves her would notice. Her gait is still a little uneven, but steadier than it was. The trembling that once made every movement look like it might be her last is now just a faint quiver when she's tired. There are days when she moves slowly and rests often. And there are days when she surprises everyone. One of those days came in late spring. The snow had finally given up its hold on the valley. The air smelled of damp needles and thawed earth. Grace stood by the fence, hands wrapped around that same chipped blue mug, watching Hazel stroll the perimeter. 6 months of antifungal medications, blood draws, careful feeding, and check-ins with Green Hollow had brought them to this moment. Not a finish line, but a milestone. Hazel paused at the base of her favorite rock, the one she hadn't truly claimed in almost a year. For a long time, she'd chosen the lower log instead, the shorter step that didn't ask as much from her body. This time, she sat, eyes on the rock, tail tip tapping. You could almost see the calculation in her shoulders. Grace didn't call out, didn't coax. She knew this wasn't her choice to make. It was Hazel's. The bobcat rose, muscles working under her spotted fur, and jumped. It wasn't graceful. Her back feet scrambled for a second that felt like a lifetime, but then she was up, standing on that old sun-warmed perch as she'd never left it. The morning light caught the tufts on her ears, the faint silver along her muzzle. She stood there, chest lifting, as if she were breathing the whole valley back into her. Grace felt her throat close. She had watched Hazel fall so many times during the illness that her body had memorized the shape of dread. Now she was watching something else entirely. A return. Not the fairy tale kind, where everything goes back to perfect, but the real world kind, where better is more than enough to make you cry. She laughed, the sound breaking into tears halfway through, and Hazel flicked an ear in her direction as if to say, "Of course I'm up here. Where else would I be?" That's how this miracle showed itself. Not in flashing lights or dramatic speeches, but in small, heartwarming stories you could miss if you weren't paying attention. Hazel eating a full meal for the first time in months. Hazel is batting at a rope toy again. Hazel chuffing when Grace approached the fence. A rough, affectionate sound that felt like love wrapped in fur. Life at High Ridge wove itself around her recovery. The volunteers folded her medication into routines the way you fold sugar into coffee. Margaret kept bringing little offerings, pine cones, feathers, leaves, and setting them by the rock, smiling every time Hazel hopped down to inspect them. Blair, who had once stood in that treatment room trying not to cry, now took quiet pride in logging Hazel's progress. Weight creeping up, coat growing glossier, eyes more alert. The center itself seemed to breathe easier. Many animals never get this kind of second chance. Foxes are hit by cars, owls poisoned by rodent bait. Sit of the wild, whose stories end under headlights or in quiet fields, unknown to anyone. That's part of the truth too, and Grace carries it with her. It's what makes Hazel's survival feel so soulful, so precious. Not because it's a happy ending that erases all the losses, but because it sits right beside them, proving that kindness and loyalty are still worth the effort, even when they don't always lead to the outcome we pray for. Grace knows she'll never look at a diagnosis the same way again. She still respects science. She still believes in humane euthanasia when an animal's suffering is too great, and there truly is no path forward. But she's learned to hold space for one more question, one more test, one more email to someone who might know a little more. When she talks to visitors now,
especially those in that 50s and 60s age range who linger a bit longer by Hazel's enclosure. She sometimes tells the story in pieces, not as a lecture, not as one of those tidy moral stories, but as a conversation. She'll say, "We thought we were planning her last day," and pause, watching their faces. She'll mention the hug, the email, the long drive, the months at Green Hollow, and almost every time, someone will nod with tears in their eyes and say, "We went through something like that once." It's in those moments that this becomes more than an inspirational story about a bobcat. It becomes a mirror, a way for people to remember the cat they fought to save, the father they sat beside in hospice, the friend they drove to every appointment. It's about the way love keeps showing up, even when the road is foggy and the outcome is uncertain. 6 months after that almost goodbye, Grace stands by the fence in the evening, thermos of tea cooling in her hands. Hazel is on her rock, eyes half closed, tail draped over the edge. The sky is turning that soft, deep blue that comes just before dark. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote calls. Hazel's ears twitch, but she doesn't get up. She's home. Grace feels something settle in her chest that she hasn't felt in a very long time. Not the frantic grip of fear, not the ache of looming loss. Just gratitude. Gratitude that the experts were willing to say, maybe we're wrong. Gratitude that Maria lowered the syringe instead of pushing it forward. Gratitude for the long miles, the pines of Green Hollow, the medicine that slowly cleared the fog from Hazel's nervous system. Gratitude that in a world where so much feels harsh and fast, there are still corners where kindness moves at the speed of a beating heart. And maybe that's the different kind of miracle here. Not that Hazel survived, though that alone feels like a gift, but that this whole journey has reminded everyone at High Ridge, and maybe all of us watching, that love and loyalty are not wasted, even when the ending is uncertain. They change us. They soften us. They nudge us a little closer to the people we're meant to be. As you sit with Hazel's story, I'd like to gently turn the question toward you. Is there someone in your life, a person, an animal, even a part of yourself, that you've been afraid it's too late to fight for, or too hard to forgive, or too painful to check on again? Maybe Hazel's journey is your reminder that it's okay to look twice, to ask one more question, to let kindness have a little more room in the way you move through the world. If this bobcat's hug, her long road back, and the quiet love at High Ridge touched something in your own heart, I'd be grateful if you'd tap like, subscribe, and stay with us for more gentle, healing stories from the wild. And if you feel called to go one step further, yours real medicine and real hope for the next wild soul who needs it.